Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about this issue of the diagrams. What are they really signifying, and what might be the best way of placing them within this diagram? I I had them. I was kind of talking about in a previous video whether they really belonged here within the realm of phenomena. And increasingly, I'm thinking that's really not a good way of putting it. The problem with them being out here is that it suggests that the two yang would be associated with this location. But really, that's not what's going on, because what I'm saying is that the top line observer, right, and the bottom line phenomena have a cyclical pattern that is kind of denoted within taijitsu, within the taiji yin-yang symbol. But this is, you don't necessarily, you get the sense of four entities within taiji symbol, but you don't get the relational progression suggested by the diagrams. It's interesting to think about, what does it mean when yin appears within yang? What does it mean when yang appears within yin? And I was saying in that integration video that I made that yang within yin is kind of like the being within substance. So it's the spirit within substance. It's the animating spark within phenomena. Life, in essence. Right? And, it can be argued whether or not there is anything that isn't that. I tend to like that idea. It's, of course, just an idea, but it makes a lot of sense, and it also, I think, has some really great byproducts. If you see everything as being conscious, then you have much more respect for things, whereas if you see things as being inert material, then you can theoretically do whatever you want to it, because it doesn't matter, it doesn't care. But conscious things all do care. They have an experience of what's going on. And so if you're going to torture matter, then you're fundamentally torturing consciousness, if it turns out that it is conscious. So anyway, that's a different rabbit hole. Maybe we'll go down that at some point. There's a paper I wrote about, a few different articles I've written about it, and if I remember, I'll include them in the video notes here. But what does it mean when yin shows up in yang? I mean, one way of looking at it is that this is the dispassionate observer here. And this is the one that's involved in the phenomena. And so that's why I associate the Bagua as I do. So this would be the mind where the material realm is taken as being the primary story. And this one, the material realm is sort of viewed from afar, I guess you could say, or it takes at least a secondary position with respect to the spirit. Right. So a traditional way of framing that would be that, God is the most important thing, and what happens here in the realm of mortals is secondary, and we don't really fully understand any of it. I guess would also be part of that, because we're embodied, we're inside of this creation. So you could look at this also as, here's the creation inside of the observer. If this is also, we can think of this as spirit, and the way that we usually refer spirit and matter, right? So if this is the Great Spirit, you could think of that as being the creation, right? And then, this would be the creation. Within it, the sort of visiting spirit in the form of sentient beings. the things which have awareness and experience. It's hard to say whether or not the Great Spirit is experiencing. I mean, I think of it that the Great Spirit is experiencing through us. But that this position of the great well of spirit, the totality of spirit, is not a position from which one can experience. Because as far as we know, experience requires sensation. And the sensation is gathered through the immersion in the phenomena, in the matter. So that's why I think there's some really brilliant stuff to some of the, I think it's like Rosicrucian and the Steiner way of looking at things, where they're talking about how the angels descended and, some of them had imagination, which created some sort of phenomena. But then it was the ones who became enthusiastic, the enthusiai, I think is what they call them, that kind of fell into that imagination and began to believe in it. And that's how the world was made real. At any rate, what we're fundamentally talking about here is the interaction between observer and phenomena, spirit and matter. You could say understanding and substance. I think that's a neat one. Lawrence Lyons, otherwise known as Bala, wrote a crazy book called The Language Crystal. It's a very interesting book. I think it is kind of crazy, but it's very interesting. And he has this whole, his basic duality is between understanding and substance. And the thing that I really like about that way of framing it, if you take a look at it, understanding, so it's understanding, and then substance, stance. It's the same word. There's this idea that somehow or another spirit and matter would be separate from each other. But particularly, I think if we're going to go with the model of, I believe the term is panpsychism, where everything is conscious, well, there really wouldn't be a separation then. And even if there were a separation between spirit and matter, it's unclear that the one could exist without the other. Because it seems that the universe does consist of incommensurate oppositions. So you can't really have light and dark separate from each other. You can't have hot and cold separate from each other. You can't have density and vacuity separate from each other. So fundamentally, you can't have yin and yang separate from each other. And that means that on some level, this is all an artificial distinction, and that unity is the truth, which is beautiful. Probably one of the primary themes in all the great wisdom traditions, right? Yoga means unity. And monotheism also implies the idea of a unity. And yet we see all of this phenomena that apparently has all of these distinctions within it. So that's true too, right? I mean, even if it's all a dream, Maya, right? The dream has distinction within it. But this is a dream that's incredibly visceral, and I think it's foolish to think of it as just a dream, right? Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. It is until the rubber hits the road, and then it's like miserably, 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 life is but a nightmare. So we have to take it seriously, because this is what we're experiencing. It's not just a dream to be tossed aside with a flippant remark and say it's all relative and it doesn't matter. That, I think, is nihilistic. Not really understanding the significance and the seriousness of it. What we're describing with the digrams is the dialectic between observer and phenomena. And again, as I was saying in that integration video, it doesn't matter if fundamentally everything is observer, if the observer inside of the phenomena experiences itself as the only observer. Now, we'll get messages from the phenomena that there are other observers. So we all pretty well know, except for those of us who are mentally ill, I guess you'd have to say. We all know that there are other observers. You know, some people think it's only other people. I think those of us who have had some exposure to other living creatures, you know, some people think it's just people and pets, because that's what they have experience with, right? But I think most people who have had experience with nature and really observe what's going on, which is, of course, what the observer does, will recognize that there are observers all over the place. But nevertheless, we still experience it as if we were the only observer. Our experiences of this life. And so here's the dialectic between the observer and the phenomena. What I'm going to suggest is that a yin observer is one that has kind of gotten sucked into. Now, this is the distinction that's interesting, because you could say that the yin observer is the one that's gotten sucked into the phenomena. You could say that. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Because the idea that I was playing with before is that the yang observer is the one that really understands what's going on. And that always sort of implies what's going on within the world, right? But I'm not sure if that's really an adequate way of describing this. Because on a certain level, the material world doesn't operate on a physical basis. It's like, if we understand how the phenomena works, we're missing the relationship with the observer. So when the observer starts to think that the phenomena is the thing that's going to sort of, if they can figure out the phenomena, then everything will be okay. You could say that that's basically the scientific process, right? Like the Golden Age was something which integrated spirit with matter and saw it as a unity, right? But yin, of course, diverges, and there's a distinction. And so a distinction between the spiritual and the material, you know, the sort of mind-body duality, I guess you could say, might be where we started to go wrong, where we started to separate the spiritual understanding from the understanding of the matter, right? And science said, hey, we can't really understand this domain. It's all turned into a bunch of nonsense thanks to our religious leaders, is kind of what the claim was. And, you know, politically, there's a lot of truth to that, you know, and the pattern that you see over and over again within, well, throughout the Bible, for instance, and through a lot of ancient texts, is that there's an understanding that's connected to spirit that then follows this pattern. It loses it. And then whatever it is that was the venture, the civilization, the religion, the understanding of things, and the kind of way the world is holding together, all that falls apart. So this is a long-winded way of basically saying that when we're talking about yang, a yang observer, it's not the right understanding of the phenomena. You could say it's the understanding of unity, the interconnection of things. And that understanding incorporating the most fundamental truth, which is that we don't understand. That our understanding is very limited. And that when we think we understand something and we kind of subdivide things and reduce, we may be able to get a certain type of response for a while from the phenomena, right? But whenever there's a reductionist method brought to bear on things, it's destructive. So it's like I was talking about before, that we have incredibly powerful technologies, but most of them are incredibly destructive. We don't have a powerful technology that restores integrity to the world. And by integrity, I mean the proper functioning of all the various systems. The natural world tends to be harmed by our powerful technologies. And likewise, and as a consequence, our social structures, our governments and institutions and religious organizations, they also suffer as a consequence of these, let's say, broken understandings. Because yin disperses. You could say that this is where things come into being, come into the world of phenomena. And yang unifies. Yang starts to put things into some kind of order. And order is typically, really well-structured order has a single node at the very top. And so you could say that the yin within yang has the same effect, right? The yin within yang disperses within spirit. That's why I say that there's an inverse relation between spirit and substance. So you could say that this is the formation of doubt, right? And that the prenatal is the method of correcting that doubt through understanding, well, our own ignorance, right? And recognizing that heaven, the unity, right, unification of all time, is the ultimate truth. And that we're just subject to that, regardless of what we think. So you banish doubt by understanding our ignorance. Here, it's the consciousness within substance that brings order, right? So because the primary mode of the material world is one of thermodynamic decay, where things are sort of falling apart, consciousness is the thing that's able to take that and make some order out of it. Isn't that incredibly obvious, right? That it's the living beings which make order out of what would otherwise be a completely chaotic world. And, wherever we see places where there are no living beings, there's not much order except in sort of large geological scales. We call that a wasteland, right? Because on some level, from the point of view of a living thing, it's going to waste. It's not being utilized. The thing, of course, of what does it mean when yin, when the observed becomes yang, right? It's pretty obvious, but maybe worth mentioning. It means it becomes enlivened. And by being enlivened, it's useful to living things. Beneficial for living things. Because a dead world is of no use to living things. The proper functioning of a world is that there are new beings arriving and old ones departing. You could see that also as a fundamental yin-yang interaction. you know, if we're going to say that all material has a spirit to it, then you could say that this is where the creation occurs. And the spirit gets involved in it. And then as it takes on its own life, you could think of all this as taking place within here. But it kind of unfurls, right? And it reaches its fullness, the fullness of its potential. And then it has to return to spirit. So that's the basic dialectic between spirit and substance. So you could think of this as the moment where something is born. The consciousness enters its own creation. It becomes enthusiastic for the world. And then here is where it forgets that it was ever spirit separate from substance, and it's just wrapped up in that world, and it gets ever more kind of mired down in it until that world is no longer able to hold it because of the lack of spirit. This is like a materialist place. And so it returns to spirit. It exits the phenomena, returns to spirit, to refresh the phenomena with spirit. Okay, I think that about says it. I hope you found that interesting. I apologize, it was a little rambling, but I think the basic idea is there. Of course, if you'd like to assist in supporting these endeavors, probably the best thing at this point would be to just simply let others who you know who might find this interesting that, hey, this is going on, why don't you check it out? But if you do have a few extra shekels that you'd like to pitch my way, there's info in the video description on how you could do that. Okay. Until next time, adios.